Chart. All right. Hello, everybody. This is Venkat from Ribbon Farm, and I am doing this experimental video podcast type thing for probably the first time. And I have with me Simon Wardley of the Leading Edge Forum and Dave Gray, author of Liminal Thinking, a recent book, and his older book, The Connected Company. And we are here to talk about mapping. So Simon has, as many of you know, his Wardley mapping technique for figuring out the context a company operates in. And Dave does a lot of consulting around culture mapping to figure out the inner realities of a company. So let's dive right in, and let's start with Simon. Maybe you can give us like a quick example and overview of what your mapping technique involves. So you can share your screen and talk us through something.
Sure, certainly. Well, I'll start talking and then I'll jump into sharing the screen. I suppose I better go back a little bit, talk about the history of mapping for me. I was running a company. It had been bought out by Canon. We were competing against others. I realized our strategy was pretty much the same as everybody else that we were competing. It had the same sort of terms, the same sort of means. And in fact, I realized the way we were formulating strategy was simply, just doing what everybody else was doing. And I kept on thinking there's something missing here. And what I started to understand or appreciate is what was missing was I didn't have a way of describing the environment that I competed in. And so I developed this technique called mapping, and I made it Creative Commons. I used it both at my company and then at Canonical when we attacked the cloud space. But for the next 5 to 6 years, so between 2005 to 2011, that sort of period, I was under this assumption that everybody else in the world mapped. It's just I'd never been on the right courses, I'd never read the right books or anything. So I'd had to invent this cheapo way of doing it because I didn't know, I just obviously didn't have an MBA and all the rest of it. So there we are. And it was about 2011, maybe early 2012, I started to realize that actually other companies didn't understand their landscape either. It was like a huge shock. I sort of didn't believe it to begin with. And that a lot of the problems that we face in terms of like duplication, bias, the fact that we apply one-size-fits-all methods, outsource too much, and a lot of the weakness in strategic play comes from simply not understanding the environment. So the mapping technique I've used at the LEF for doing other research, but it's like being a carpenter. I make chairs and I'm using this chisel, and then suddenly everybody kept on coming up and saying, the chair's great, but what's that chisel? And it's just like, well, don't you know what a chisel is? And everybody was, no. So all of a sudden I find myself teaching other people what a chisel is. And it is a bizarre world. So let me see if I can share this screen. Hang on a second. Desktop, screen. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see something called steps?
Yep.
Yes?
Yes.
So, right. So step one. I suppose very simply, when we talk about strategy and we talk about why, there are actually two whys. There's the why of purpose, your moral imperative, your scope. So it's like if you're playing a game of chess, there's the why I'm playing because I want to win. But there's also the why of movement, and that's totally separate. That's the should I move this? Well, it's separate and related. Should I move this piece over that piece? And that requires you to understand the landscape, i.e. the board, the climactic patterns, i.e. the rules of the game. Then there's like the universal patterns doctrine, and then there's context-specific gameplay, which is the leadership part. Now, a way of understanding that is obviously Sun Tzu's 5 factors: purpose, landscape, climate, doctrine, leadership. That's in the middle of the circle. But I also like Boyd's OODA loop. So you've got the game, Then you're about observing the environment. That's landscape climatic patterns, which you can use for anticipation. Then you're orientating yourself around it, which is doctrine. And then you're making some sort of decision to act. And that, of course, will influence your purpose. So we were talking about Nokia a little bit earlier. You start off as a paper mill. The process of acting turns you into a plastics manufacturer, and then over time its action turns you into a telecommunications company, and then whatever it is turning into today. So part of this process is understand the landscape, and this is what a map looks like. It's very simple. Any map requires a couple of basic characteristics. It's got to be visual. It's got to be context specific, so the battle at hand. You need position, but that requires you to have an anchor. So in a geographical map, the anchor is the compass. So this is north or south of this. In a chessboard, the anchor is actually the board itself. So this piece has this position on the board or another position. The other thing you need to be able to see is movement. So how things can move in the map. And obviously there needs to be components. So this is what a basic simple map looks like. And so you start with the anchor at the top, which is the user and user needs. And from that, then you have multiple different components going down the map. And the movement is represented by the evolution axis. So what you have is the genesis of new things. First time they appear, then they evolve through competition, custom-built examples. Then you get products and rental services and commodity and utility services. Now, once you have a map, it becomes relatively easy to start learning common economic patterns. Everything's evolving from left to right due to supply and demand competition. As things evolve to the right, they enable higher order systems. And then you start learning more complex patterns like co-evolution of practice, how organizations form. And so you can use this to start to anticipate change. And then you start learning things like characteristics change. On the left-hand side, everything is uncharted, so unexplored, chaotic, uncertain, changing, very good for agile. And then as you move along, you're about defining what the thing is, you've got an idea of what it is, you're more about learning. So things like lean, which is basically aspects of agile plus some other artifacts become more important. And eventually the thing becomes industrialized, common, repeated, it's deviation is bad. And in there you learn a different set of characteristics. So what happens is you start with your map, you start to learn patterns of climatic change so you can anticipate. Then you start to learn universal doctrine, where you apply methods. And eventually, over time, it's an iterative process, you learn how to manipulate the map with things like open approaches, patterns, and all different forms of gameplay, use of constraints, and so forth. And that basically is it.
Awesome. All right, let's take a look at Dave's stuff and how you do something similar with internal realities. So Dave, you want to take over and explain your stuff?
Sure, yeah. I think we have to, it says I cannot.
You have to stop sharing, Simon, I think. You have to stop sharing your screen.
Well, this is technology for you. I'm trying to desperately find. Having never used this thing, it seems to have taken over the computer.
Yeah, I like the view of the mountains, though. It's lovely.
Yes. Ooh, excellent. Is there a shortcut key that you know?
If you go back to the app switcher and click the zoom camera thing, that should have a button for stop sharing.
I just clicked a thing called request control.Maybe that helps.
Yes, it said, I have just approved your request to control it.
Okay, all right, let's see what happens here. Okay, options.
All right.
Oh, whoops, I'm controlling your screen now. That's not good.
Technology, isn't it marvelous?
Give up control. All right.
Let's see if I can do something.
Oh, hang on. Stop share. I found it.
There we go.
Oh, we should be on Google Hangouts instead. Remind me to short Zoom tomorrow.
All right.
I will share, and I hope I don't. I hope I can give it back when I'm done here.
Probably my fault for not learning the admin tools properly, but yeah. All right, culture maps.
Let me know if you can see this.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. So I'm just going to draw on this. This is a culture map. I think was one of the things that's interesting to me about your map, Simon, is this idea of movement. And this is, most maps I think of as relatively static. They're a snapshot in time, and these would be in that category, that this is a snapshot in time. One of the ways that we show movement in culture maps is simply by doing multiple maps.
Mm-hmm.
But this is basically very, very simple, and it has been kind of intentionally designed to be relatively self-explanatory. So you'll see here that there are, it's modeled on something, structurally it's modeled on something called the Business Model Canvas by a guy named Alex Osterwalder. And he has some philosophies about tools, design tools, especially in business. One of them being, it should be something that you can pick up and is relatively self-explanatory. So you'll see there's a bunch of text in here that's probably not that readable, but they are essentially, they're trigger questions. They are definitions of what the term means. So here's a term, outcomes, here's a definition. Outcomes are tangible results often expressed in terms of time and money. And here are some trigger questions that, people can use to start filling in the map. And this is intended for anyone to be able to visualize in a pretty rapid fashion the dynamics that are driving their culture. I think I should start by just giving a quick definition of culture, as there are many. But the definition that I like is culture is simply the collective behavior of any group or organization. So a lot of times we don't even use the word culture when we're talking about it with organizations. We talk about behaviors because a lot of organizations are very familiar with the idea of behavior. Culture may seem fuzzy, but behavior is something they understand, and they realize when it needs to change, they recognize it. So everything starts with behaviors, and we look up and down from this for what are the outcomes, what are the results that we get from the behaviors that we exhibit, and then what are the things that are the enablers and blockers that either cause or influence behavior. And so what we're doing with this map, it's a very kind of anthropological tool. It has no assumptions about what a good culture is or what a bad culture is. It has no assumptions about whether your culture is good or bad or positive or negative. What I like to say is, one of the things that I like to give people as a metaphor to think about culture is that culture in a way is like a garden. And I'm going to draw something in here, like a kind of a tree or something, plant. But, just like some people bristle a little bit about the idea that culture can be designed. And I think for good reason. Culture is something that is relatively organic. It emerges. You have culture in any organization, whether you're being intentional about it or not. And the idea of the culture map is to say, not that we can design culture in the sense that you could design a car, that you can make a very specific blueprint and you can design a specific thing, but that you can design your culture in the way that you design a garden. If you understand the climate, to Simon's point, if you understand the climate and in the environment that you're in, you will understand that certain things are going to be able to grow in that climate and certain things are not going to be able to grow. If you understand the conditions on the soil and so forth. And so you're going to design a garden based on your understanding of the conditions in the environment and based on what you think you can accomplish. And then the other thing about a garden that's very, similar to how I think about culture is a garden is not going to grow on your timeline. A garden is going to grow on its timeline, and human behavior and culture is very similar. It's relatively organic. It has its seasons. It has its, people taking on new habits and behaviors is not something that you do quickly, although sometimes it can happen quickly if you structure things in right. If you plant bamboo, it's going to probably grow pretty quickly. If you plant a pumpkin, it's going to take a year. So I think it's a good way of thinking about culture because it puts people in the right perspective in the right time zone. And so if you think about enablers and blockers, these are the things usually that are under the control of management that they can actually put in place that will enable or block the kind of behaviors that they want and don't want. The behavior is like the plant growing, and then the outcomes are kind of like the fruits, the things that come out of the ground that we harvest. They're the actual thing that we're shooting for. And these things all have direct relationship with each other. And what we do, usually in a mapping session, which usually takes about 90 minutes with a team, is we first determine what is the culture that we're looking at. Because you can look at culture in the same way that you can look at any kind of business environment. Your level of altitude is very important. You can map the culture of an individual team. You can map the culture of a regional. You can map a department. You could map the finance team. You could map a whole company. And just in the way that environmentalists, when people study natural ecosystems, an ecosystem is the scope of an ecosystem is what you decide it is. You can study the ecosystem in a one rotten log, or you can decide that you can examine the ecosystem of the entire Amazon rainforest or the entire Earth's biome. And based on the level of abstraction that you choose, you're going to have more or less granularity, basically. And so we might start by people might start mapping the culture of their team, or they might map the culture of the company. So we want to set that frame at the beginning. And then we start asking questions. And I usually start with behavior because that's the easiest thing for people to start with. Asking questions like, what does a great day here look like? What was the best day you ever had here, and what made it great? What was a terrible day here look like, and what made it bad? And sometimes we might divide the map into behaviors that people consider positive and behaviors that people consider negative. Sometimes we may start with some understanding that the company has for outcomes. We want to become more collaborative, let's say. We want to become more entrepreneurial and collaborative. I hear that a lot these days. Entrepreneurial, collaborative, yeah. And then over here, we are siloed, we are departmentalized, whatever. So we're wanting to move away from this to this. So we start collecting on sticky notes people's thoughts. And another thing I learned from Alex, who I have the tremendous amount of respect for, is that working in slices, he calls it, is very helpful. So we might say, okay, here's a behavior. What's the outcome of that behavior? What do we get? What's the outcome of that? And what is it that enables that? And we might hear, for example, well, behavior is we don't pay attention to each other in meetings. We're not really listening to each other. And the outcome of that might be, well, we end up misunderstanding, we end up miscommunicating, bumping into each other. We are slow because of that. We are slow and we bump into each other. Well, what enables that? Well, what enables that is maybe digital technology. We've always got our phones on when we're in our meeting. And we might say that sometimes we find that these things are totally addressable within a team. They don't require any management change. Sometimes they're not. So we work in slices like this, and then we actually look for connections that cross the silos for, that sometimes there is one thing that influences many things. I've seen a lot of stuff where people are talking about, gaming the metrics. That's a very common one. We have metrics and people are achieving the metrics, but they're missing the spirit of the metrics. They're doing the wrong thing to get the number to where it needs to go. I remember working with the bank, and the CEO of the bank was running around saying, we need to obsess over customers. We need to obsess over customers. And people were trying to make the metrics. And one of the metrics was to reduce the number of complaints. And so the people who were running the call center had too many complaints. Their complaint number was high. So they took the phone number off the website. So nobody could have the number, so nobody could call the call center, so complaints would go down. Well, obviously that's not driving the kind of result that the CEO is really asking for. So we often find that there are behaviors that are already happening in pockets that are positive, that are generally heading in the right direction. And we might take this whole current state map and then do a desired state map and say, okay, let's try and design the organization that you want to be. I think that's probably good enough for now.
Mm-hmm.
Then we can head into a conversation about it, because I'm really curious to talk about the whole, and interested to talk about the whole idea of design tools and visualization. I'm curious about your background, Simon. You sound like mapping was very natural to you, and I'm wondering, is there something about where you came from that made mapping kind of a natural go-to thing for you? I studied design in school, so for me, visualization was always a part of everything. So I'm interested in hearing, where did that mapping thing come from?
How did it be? Combination of accidents, being a geneticist, having an interest in maths, being a chess player. Can I grab the screen back at all? Other than the fact that I'll probably lose it again. Give it back to you.
I think you have the, you should be able to do that.
Right, super. So let me share screen again. Excellent. Right. This will be fun. Okay, so you've got the landscape, and I'll come to where it came from in a second. Once you have the landscape, you start to learn sort of common climatic patterns. So the map is not static, it's dynamic. Everything is evolving from left to right due to competition. And one of the interesting things is, of course, when we shift across these boundaries, say from product to commodity utility, we often hit inertia within an organization caused by past success. So they've got very used to dealing with something in a particular way, a set of practices around it, which gives it a problem, has to overcome in order to adapt as the thing evolves to more utility. And you see that a lot with cloud today. Now, the point is there are lots and lots of patterns which once you map an environment, you start to come out. And so what you can then do is use it to anticipate likely change. So this is a map which basically comes from 2005. We had an online photo business. We knew that compute would go to a utility. We knew that platform would go to a utility. We knew that that would enable new sources of things to appear, new sources of worth. And we knew our line of business there was also going to evolve through competition. And the point about that map is that now I have multiple ways that I can attack. I could decide to build the first compute utility, first utility platform, which is what we did in 2006, wait until others have moved and then build new things on top, or drive our core business to more of a commodity itself. And fundamentally, the maps become a mechanism of, doesn't matter whether it's IT or business or finance, we can talk about the same problem and challenge the assumptions that we've made. Now, when it comes to doctrine, so doctrine is more this sort of how you organize yourself. What I found was there's again quite a list of different forms of doctrine. One of them focuses on user needs, which is the anchor. Another one is about use of cell-based structures, teams located around certain aspects of your map. But also interestingly, it turned out that your teams not only needed aptitude for certain things like engineering or finance or marketing, but there was also attitude. So engineering in the genesis of something is very different from engineering when you're taking it from custom built to a product. And that's very different from engineering when you're shifting it from product to, say, a utility. And so what I started to discover was we didn't have one culture. We needed 3 separate cultures, which we call pioneer settlers and town planners. And that comes from, as a derivative from Cringely's marvelous Accidental Empires book of 1993. But what I wanted to talk about in particular is this concept of movement. So this is a map of the Battle of Thermopylae. So the politician Themistocles, he had a problem. The Persians were invading. He had choices. He could defend around Athens or Thebes. what he decided to do was block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along the coastal road into a narrow pass called Thermopylae, or the Hot Gates, where a small number of Greeks, including 300 odd Spartans, could defend against a larger force. Now the map, this sort of map works because it's visual, it's context specific. You have the position of pieces relative to the anchor, which is the compass, but you can also describe movement on it. Now, if you take away those abilities, it becomes more difficult to learn about an environment. And my favorite, and I always knock this, particularly because it's a 2x2, I knew you would love this, because you can simplify this. So I like to imagine, if you imagine you're on the eve of battle and you're standing there and Themistocles is in front of you and he's saying, I do not understand the landscape, I do not understand the environment, but have no fear, for I have created a SWOT diagram. So strengths, a well-trained Spartan army, high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave, weaknesses, the E4s might stop the Spartans turning out. Well, if he said that, I would run away in fear. But if we think about what would you use to determine and communicate strategy in battle, would you use a map or a SWOT diagram? I mean, it should be fairly obvious we use position and movement in the military. And of course, you wouldn't dream of trying to organize a battle through a SWOT diagram, because it'd be like, the troops asking, where do we go? I mean, you've got nothing. But the thing that really struck me is when I looked at business, this is exactly what we used. SWOT diagrams, or 2x2s. When we talk about navigation in business, we use stories like the Vikings did. We don't tend to use maps. Most of the stuff that we do is often, meme copying, magic sequences, that sort of thing, rather than learning about the environment. So I suppose that's the source. It was. I also had a background in military history and interest in that subject. And I suppose that's the source of where it came from, is a realization we were fighting, but without maps. At that point, I'm going to, yes, I found the Zoom thing. Hang on. Can I this time? Yes, stop share. There we are. Wonderful. I found it.
Let me take a moment here to sort of reflect back what I heard from you guys. And it's kind of, I'm not going to take the bait, Simon, and debate you on 2x2s, because I have a lot of fun with them. But one of the interesting, so it's a bunch of correspondences between the way you guys model reality jumped out at me. One is this idea of position and movement. And Dave, you said that culture, if you do this anthropological approach, the best thing you can do is take sequences of snapshots, because really that's kind of how you can discover internal culture. So you can sort of think of culture moving through time as well. So it's a very slow piece, right? And
this is in this case, what we're mapping is what we're using the visual space for is mapping cause or influence, as opposed to we're mapping movement over time. The fact is that culture is not something you can change very rapidly anyway. But Simon, in looking at your maps, I could see those vertical dotted lines as being very treacherous transitions for company to make from pioneer to settler, and from settler to town planner. To your point, there are dramatically different cultures that are needed in these categories. And I think I did mention Nokia earlier, because I had been doing some work there as a consultant and saw the transition that they made. And they were very, very, they excelled in the town planner realm, and they were moving into an area where they were going to be required to be pioneers. Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of a, it's almost like they had to go off the right end of your map and enter into the left again. It's almost like a full circle. And they were just really ill-equipped to enter in, even though the company had a lot of pioneering in its history.
Yeah,
they made a strategic decision. I imagine if they had both culture maps and Wardley maps at the time, they might have made some different decisions, because the strategic decision that they made was to take all of the things that were not mobile phone. They sold off everything and divested themselves of everything other than mobile phones. They put all of their energy and bets on this one technology where they had the absolute highest risk. And I think that, they were pretty diversified until somewhere in the early 2000s when they decided to make this major bet. And I think having had these maps, I think some of those decisions might have been made very differently.
So let's explore that a little bit. So it seems to me that culture in particular, you can think of it as three levels of variety in culture. The first level of variety is between companies, where you could say that one company is more aggressive than the other or something like that. So within sectors, you might have styles of competition with different cultures in different companies. Then you might have within a single company, especially a large conglomerate, different divisions being in different stages of evolution according to like Simon's scheme or maybe Jeffrey Moore's scheme. You have like some parts of the company that are town planner like, other parts that are doing a more exploratory thing. And these are kind of like, there are different paths in their own subplots of time. But here's one thing that interests me, which is dramatic shifts in the culture of either a company or a sector that sort of affect all at once. And one of the big ones that gets talked about a lot is shift from wartime CEO mode to peacetime CEO mode. And I have actually seen this happen a couple of times. So it's a real thing, but I'm not entirely sure people understand it correctly. So since we're talking about the Battle of Thermopylae and military examples, maybe you can both give your take on this whole wartime to peacetime CEO transition and what it means both culturally and strategically.
Okay. Dave, do you want to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to say, you were talking about culture, and I just did want to kind of point out that I think most companies do not have a good way to examine and kind of quantify or qualify their culture as an asset or a liability that they, we have on the balance sheet. We have a lot of things that can be quantified. We have, technology, intellectual property, and so forth. Culture being the collective behavior of a group. I mean, if you look at, let's just take, since we're talking about military history, the U.S. Marines have a very clear, very well-defined culture. That is their primary asset. The weapons have changed over 100 years or so, but the primary asset of that group of people is the culture. It is the culture. And I think that companies, military organizations actually understand this very well because their technology is always changing and tactics are always changing. They do use maps. They understand the value of maps, I think. And, students of military history can see this. But I think organizations have a very limited view. There are some organizations who thrive, who really do understand culture, and Southwest Airlines is one of them. Nokia was actually celebrated. Nokia was written up in Harvard Business Review for having one of the best company cultures in the world. However, the experts or masters of organizational culture did not, I think became maybe a bit overly proud and did not really recognize the liabilities that are inherent in any culture. Culture is an asset when it's a good fit for the environment. And this, I think, gets to the wartime, peacetime CEO thing, and also the wartime, peacetime organization, or however you want to describe it. There are, when the culture is not good or bad in and of itself, a culture in a highly competitive environment that is super collaborative may find itself in big trouble. I think that the fact that, and I think what Simon's maps are really good at demonstrating is that environments are not static. Environments change over time, and sometimes they can change very rapidly and they can become very volatile, or they can be very stable. And there are going to be aspects of any environment that are volatile and aspects that are stable at any given moment. And so the culture of an organization not only can be something that we say, okay, we have to shift the culture because we're moving into this chaotic environment. It could also be that we have actually a really good culture for this thing. Therefore, we're going to choose to compete here, not here. And, I think what happens in a lot of organizations today is we get our big eyes because we see the Internet of Things and virtual reality, and we have to go there because that's the future. I actually think, comparing Nokia with a company, for example, like Samsung, very similar company in a lot of ways in 2005 or 2007 or so when the iPhone came out. But what Samsung took a very, very different strategic approach. Samsung recognized that their strength was manufacturing, and they said, we're going to make sure that you can run any operating system on a Samsung device. You can run Microsoft on it. You can run Android on it. In fact, we'll make parts for Apple. We'll make screens and things and sell them to Apple. We're good at making the actual physical technologies. We're going to make sure that we place bets across all of the operating systems. So no matter what operating system wins, you're going to be able to get a Samsung device with.
So it almost sounds like you're making a distinction between sort of capability or competency supply-driven choice of strategy, where you're saying, all right, I have two divisions. One is good at war, one is good at peace. And the market is roughly demanding like a wartime mentality right now. So the division that's actually better at war should be the one that leads the charge, even if it's the product that it's working on may not be the exact fit. So that's one way of looking at it. And Simon, I think if I'm guessing right, you would go the other way and say the environment should dictate who leads, not competency. Would that be right?
I'm going to share some more slides if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Go right ahead.
Okay, super. And then we'll have the usual rigmarole while I try and work out how to give the slides back. So let's put this. Okay, so there's a number of different things here. So when I talk about pioneers, settlers, town planners, and they're very, very different sort of attitudes, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about IT, finance, operations. The attitudes are different for each of those different stages. So ideally, an organization should be designed for constant evolution. So when something appears like digital, you don't have to bolt on a new structure to cope with it. In the same way, when the telephone appears, we don't have to have a president of telephony or a president of electricity. Our organizations aren't designed that way, which is why we constantly bolt things on and then take them apart later. Now, if I look at this diagram, point one, we've got a component shifting from product to utility. So it's a pre-existing activity provided as a product. And so my town planner's job was to steal that stuff and turn it into a utility. That enabled, point two, and another group of people to build things on top of it more quickly. So they would create novel and new things. But what happens with the pioneers? They create the novel and new, but generally the stuff is, it's exciting but often flaky. So what you have is another group, the settlers, who steal that from them, steal from the pioneers, force them to get on pioneering. And they take that stuff and turn it into library routines, products, and then they focus on improving it in that space, learning, understanding, reducing more waste. And then eventually the town planners steal it from the settlers and industrialize it. So you get this constant process of theft. Pioneers creating and operating novel and new things, settlers stealing from them, turning that into products and library routines, which they run and operate, town planners stealing from that and turning it into more industrialized services run at massive scale. And so the focuses are different, but you create this almost virtual cycle of theft within an organization. So when you look at an organization, you've got basically balances of all those three cultures there. And we do this ourselves, but what we do is we sort of ignore it and we try to squash it into one culture or squash it into silos of organized by type. So we go, right, we'll have finance, IT, marketing, rather than structuring around how things evolve. Now, another comment I picked up on was about mapping, changing perceptions. This is, I teach people how to map, and this is about 180 different groups, and they're put through a scenario. This data comes from about 180 different groups. They're given a scenario with all the usual things like SWOT diagrams and market information, etc., and asked to make a number of strategic choices. And what they do is, in this case, pre-mapping, they tend to say, we're going to build a cloud service, invest in product development, expand overseas. And by simply introducing the concepts of mapping and understanding basic economic patterns, so you don't change the scenario, it's the same data. When they go back, their priorities change. Their first thing becomes, we've got to sell this company. It's in absolute trouble. So it is quite amazing how we make choices without understanding the environment, and the impact of what understanding the environment does to the choices that you make. And a bit like, again, military side, understanding the landscape significantly impacts the sort of choices you make. Now, the reason why I like the peace and war example is that one of the economic patterns is a cycle known as peace, war, and wonder. So what happens is you get novel new things appear, the wonder of it, the wonder of radio. And then we get a relatively peaceful state of product competition, constant improvement. You do get disruption of substitution of one product with another. Very, very difficult to predict and anticipate. But those companies build up, and they also build up inertia to change. But the act becomes suitable for more utility provision. And at that point, or more commodity provision, at that point, new entrants come in. You get a rapid period of change known as a punctuated equilibrium, an explosion of higher order systems, so new wonder, and you get changes of practice and new organizational forms. And so we're constantly going through this peace, war, and wonder, and this seems to occur at both a macro and a micro scale. At a macro scale, we call them ages, like the age of electricity, and they never start with the invention of electricity. That was like 400 AD, Parthian battery, but instead industrialization of a pre-existing act. And the beautiful thing about this shift from product to utility is it's actually moderately predictable. So this is a piece of work I did several years ago, looking at those points of war of industrialization across different industries. So like big data is already shifting into the utility form. So you have all these product vendors convinced they are the future. They normally have about 10 to 15 years once this cycle, the part of the cycle is kicked in, but we should see the growth, slow growth, and then it becomes massive. And so it's an exponential change of utility forms, changing practices, new organizational structures around it. So the whole peace war CEO is really interesting because you've got a complex environment that you exist in with components at different stages of evolution. So you need multiple different sets of cultures to cope with that. Of course, it's not static, it's dynamic, it's actually moving. And some of the things in your environment are shifting from this relatively peaceful stage of product competition, fierce, but peaceful, to this rather lethal stage where it shifts from product to utility, where you're stuck behind inertia. And if you can't see it, even though it can be anticipated, you're in all sorts of trouble.
So let me run a sort of counterfactual by you, Simon. Actually, Dave may be able to speak to the reality of this. In presenting sort of your idealized view of a company capable of continuous evolution, you use the phrase stealing, where you hope that the town planners will steal from the pioneers and so forth. And quite often what you see in companies is the opposite pattern, where the people who are in the middle of wonder and like excited about all the new stuff, they're constantly in this sort of state of trying to sell stuff downstream, and nobody's buying, and the people downstream keeping the peace are in theory supposed to be stealing the best that's coming out, like the top, skim off the cream and build it into the next new business line. But no, they're too busy preserving current cash flows, and the people tasked with actually finding and waging wars, they're like kind of like trying to avoid war and sort of propping up a fragile system as much as possible. So it's like everybody is risk averse and incentivized to go exactly the other way. And I suspect if you actually did this mapping across silos, this should pop up in sort of so this is actually a question I wanted to ask earlier on, but now might be a good time. So what are sort of the dissonances in mental models that you see across silos? Maybe that's a good way to put it. So what are the dissonances you see in mental models across silos? And does this pop up in your culture maps, Dave? Like across silos?
Well, I think the map the sort of the heat map that you showed, Simon, was very interesting to me. And I think, and your point, Venkatesh, on talking about peace versus war, or external environment versus internal capability. I think the thing is, I think it's not one or the other. They're both critically important. You have to understand the external environment to understand if you have the right internal capability. And if you have the wrong internal capability, absolutely the wrong internal capability, then you need to find another environment. If you have a capability that's just completely ill-suited. And so I think while we have this technological advancement, these points of change that you put there, Simon, they are not inevitable that a company must compete in those areas, in those categories. Mm-hmm. They are technologies. They are things that can be new capabilities that may enhance your business, but they are not necessarily the only ways that a company can compete. And look at a company like Nordstrom has done very, very well over many, many years by competing on service level, very human, very culture-driven kind of organization. I've never bought anything from Nordstrom online, but the people who are their customers are incredibly loyal. And so I think that that the external environment, it's very important for a company to understand it, especially understanding how it might be shifting in a way that affects them. That could, you don't want to be Blockbuster, right? And not see Netflix coming. But I think that there are also many other routes. And so to me, it's a matter of having a very good, strong, deep understanding of your capability, your human capability, which is, I think culture is one of the primary drivers of, and also understanding how the external environment may be offering new challenges that you had not anticipated before, which then allows you to make strategic decisions. It's not always about, following the path of technological advance.
So Dave, I'm going to ask you to make sort of like a binary, I know this is like forced binary, but a binary choice between, if push came to shove and without knowing anything more, would you recommend that on average, it's better to pick the battle to suit the culture, or better to try and shift the culture to suit the battle? Which is it, like going in blind as your sort of default null hypothesis? What would you say is the way to pick? Should you try to move the culture, or should you try to pick the battle?
Well, business is different than war in the geographical sense. Because when you have a little country like Greece, you can't choose very easily to change your territory to a completely different territory. Whereas in business, you can. You can decide. Intel decided to get out of the memory business, and Intel made a strategic decision under Andy Grove to, and they were looking at their environment, and they realized that memory was going to become an absolute commodity. It was not a business that they wanted to be in, and they shifted. So it's almost like as if the Greeks picked up and moved to, to Italy or something, which does happen, but it's a lot bigger strategic shift to say we're going to move everybody. I think that, I do think if you had to pick, culture is something that's going to change. Your internal cultural capability is something that is going to change very slowly. Imagine asking everyone in the company to learn how to speak a new language. We're all going to speak French now. We're going to do business in French.
Wait, that's not what you're saying though, right? What you were saying earlier is more like we already speak French and the environment is suddenly shifting where everybody's speaking English. So we should move where people are continuing to speak French. So it's more like you're continuing and building on the inertia of your existing culture.
Yeah, my metaphor is falling apart a little bit there, but I think
but I got the sense that, you're saying that in military and geography where there's too much of like an environmental constraint and you can't pick up and move, whereas in business, quite often there is actually an ability to move to where your strengths will work in your favor, right? So Simon.
you've actually answered the question, because the question of should we change the culture or should we change the battle, that depends upon the landscape. So depending upon the landscape that you're competing in, the environment that you're competing in, and where your competitors are, sometimes the right thing to do is change, exactly where we're competing, what we're fighting on. Sometimes it is, no, we're going to compete in that space, but we need to change the culture, where you attack. And then after you understand why this space over that space, depends upon things like your culture, your capability, your competitors, how the climate is actually changing, the forms of gameplay that you can use. So I know you give it as a binary, and the answer is, is both.
I agree.
It's always both. The answer is always both, but it's kind of interesting to get to both via forcing the binary.
But it's a really good point, because what happens in most organizations is you don't understand the landscape. So you have these almost artificial choices. It's a bit like you see this in companies doing one-size-fits-all methods. Let's go all agile, or all Six Sigma, all lean, or they do let's outsource everything. And that sort of stuff happens because you cannot see the environment. You cannot see, we simplify it down. Ashby's law of requisite variety, one of my favorite. So the controlling mechanisms of a complex system, in order to effectively control it, there's got to be as much complexity in the controlling mechanism. Well, there's two solutions to that. One, you make the controlling mechanism capable of coping with the complexity, or two, you pretend what's being managed is simple, i.e. you put 2x2s or KPIs or whatever it happens to be, and pretend that's life, and give binary choices. And that works if you're competing against somebody else who's fighting in the same way, but it's a disaster if you come up against somebody who's not competing in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. And I think, even looking at modern military history, what's happened in the last 20, 30 years or so is the U.S. has kind of built such an overwhelming military capability that the only way to fight is not to fight directly. And so we have guerrilla, terrorist, whatever you want to call, depending on your point of view, freedom fighters or terrorists. You have the organizations who have chosen to fight, and they change the game. They change the game to a game that they have the ability to win. So you can't, no one's. It's not unless maybe there are very few organizations that could militarily go in just a traditional land battle or sea battle against the United States right now. And so the organizations that have competing interests have chosen to adapt to that, and the U.S. military has to adapt to that. And so it is kind of like, well, given the situation, given the landscape, given the environment, what can we do?
Yeah.
What's your strategy going to be when you're weak? What's it going to be when you're strong? They're going to be different. What's your strategy going to be when you have very scarce resources to bring to bear? What's your strategy going to be when you have huge amount of dollars invested to invest? Mm-hmm. Apple has billions, and Apple could buy 3 car companies. With their free cash flow, they could buy. I mean, their cash flow is big. Their hoard of cash is bigger than the market cap of Mercedes-Benz. They could, so when you have that kind of resources, your strategies are going to be very different than if you're in a garage, with 3 people. I think you want to look at the landscape. You want to look at what your capabilities are. One of those pieces of capability is just cash, money, what you can buy. But the other, especially in an organization that's been around for many years, is the human factor. And as we know, as the U.S. learned in Vietnam, the human factor wins wars, not tanks. It's the human factor that wins. And I think it's a case in business as well. It is the human factor that makes a difference between winning and losing. And that's why I'm increasingly surprised at how organizations discount the importance of the human factor in their business, and they're thinking in terms of just like being in a war room, moving little toy ships around, and not forgetting the aspects of just true human leadership and the things, morale, doctrine, to use Sun Tzu, to invoke Sun Tzu.
Yeah, to your point earlier about culture being an asset or a liability, I think that's one good way to think of it, where it's not just companies like Apple that have huge numbers of dollars, but like a successful insurgency like, say, ISIS. This is a dark example, but ISIS's huge cash reserves are in the form of cultural capital, even though they're trying to be like gold nuts and issue gold caliphate coins. But this actually connects back to Boyd, who we mentioned briefly early on, where if you look at Boyd's influences from World War II and the German military model, there's 4 elements to that, right? There's Schwerpunkt, which is roughly maps to strategy. Then there's a piece called Einheit, which is trust and culture. And there's something called Fingerspitzengefühl, I think I pronounced that right, which is skill. Oh. And then there's a 4th one, which is Auftrags tactic. I'm really proud that I can pronounce this. This is tactics, right? And I've often thought of these, and if you read Boydian stuff, you see them arranged on a spectrum of things that have to do with potential energy and things that have to do with kinetic energy. And things that are to do with position and movement, they're kind of like kinetic, but the more you have potential energy, and that could be in the form of cash reserves or cultural reserves, the more sloppy you can be in your position and movement. I mean, if you're like overwhelmingly bigger than the competition, like Amazon is, you can actually afford a certain amount of sloppiness and mistakes in how you move. But of course, if you do that too long, entropy catches up and you drain all your potential energy. So I think that's kind of roughly where I'm landing, listening to both of you on sort of how you balance culture and position play. It's like balancing potential and kinetic energy under conditions of entropy. Simon, yeah.
No, I agree, and I love the examples. Just to go back to an earlier point, the idea of companies sitting around playing war games and moving pieces. Oh, I only wish. I wish they had, but they don't. I mean, a fair example would be alchemy, gut feel, whatever's popular in the HBR. I mean, we have terrible illusion of companies being strategic chess playing. That is, unfortunately, that seems to be confined to articles in the HBR rather than reality. I love this whole sort of idea of potential movement. I mean, there are various forms of capital, whether it's physical capital, financial capital, knowledge capital, social capital. In fact, when I do maps, the interfaces, components, represent actually flows of capital. And that can include things like risk as well. And so depending upon the landscape, depending upon what capital reserves, depending upon the types of culture and capabilities you have, that's all going to influence the types of moves and where you should attack. But of course, you've got to understand, first of all, where you could attack, and then you determine the why after. So that's the where of sort of the why of movement. And of course, it is all a cycle. So at the beginning, I showed the cycle: observe, orientate, decide, act, and how it links with Sun Tzu. So of course, your decision to act, your why of movement, ultimately can impact your purpose and where you go. And I also like the example of Amazon, because remember that Amazon started as a minnow, absolutely nowhere in the entire infrastructure industry, and was almost roundly dismissed. And now it is the dominant player. So, and that points to something which companies have, which is inertia caused by past success. And that's really dangerous for organizations. You mentioned Blockbuster earlier. I mean, a lot of their inertia came from late fees. And the fact that they had, they were first with a website, first with online ordering of films, first with online downloads, but they had a business model all about late fees, people, being late, bringing back their video. And that was the source of inertia, which enabled them to lose that entire battle. So fascinating.
Yep.
Yeah, and I do think Amazon's a wonderful example, and I've invested a lot of money in Amazon over the years.
Well done, Pat.
Yeah. Actually, first started buying at $12 a share in 2001. Wow. But I think I've been a huge fan of the company, both as from a customer and as a business thinker, because and if you look at Amazon, they're highly strategic, and they do recognize the importance of culture. That company has a very consistent, it's very consistent, very clear culture. Culture has been a very clear priority for that company. It's one of the few examples that I've seen of a company that has become large and continues to be very highly dynamic and highly intelligent about risk taking, whilst also being extremely efficient. I mean, you have these theoretical constructs like, well, you have to choose being customer centric or product excellence, or what's the other one? Operational efficiency. Well,
Great
Amazon.
For the 1980s.
What's that?
Great for the 1980s.
Right.
Quite some time ago.
Amazon, I think, has smashed that paradigm pretty effectively to say, look, you can be operational efficient, you can be obsessed over customers, and you can be innovative. All of those things. And I think it's. I believe that Jeff Bezos is the Henry Ford of the current millennium. I think we're going to be looking back on him. We'll look at Steve Jobs too, but I think we're going to look at Jeff Bezos as the real architect in many ways of the 21st century organization. And I think that he is a brilliant man. I think the company is. It's only even going to. It's hard for me to see. Based on the momentum and the scale of the company, it's hard for me to see it having trouble in the near future, at least.
So I'm going to agree. I took a bet a long time ago that Amazon would be the first $1 trillion market cap company, and everybody went, that's ridiculous. And I know that some people are feeling rather uncomfortable at the moment. So yes, I agree. I mean, there is a particular model which I developed for Zimke, which was a service we built back in 2005 called Innovate, Leverage, Commoditize. And the particular model is fairly simple. You commoditize a pre-existing app from product to utility. You enable everybody else to build on top of it, so expose it as a public API. So you allow everyone else to innovate. And so they create this new uncharted stuff. And then what you do is you don't look at their data, you just mine the metadata, the consumption of your service, to identify new successful patterns. So you leverage your entire ecosystem to spot new patterns, which you commoditize to new component services. And this way you grow a platform of discrete component services, getting everybody to innovate on top, and they act almost like your free research and development. Now, the downside of the model is that you have to harvest the ecosystem occasionally, so people will grumble about the fact that you've eaten their business model. But the upside is your apparent rate of innovation, because it's the entire ecosystem actually acting as a sensing engine and creating that new future. Your rate of customer focus, because you're mining metadata to give people what they want, and your rate of efficiency, because it's economies of scale, will now all simultaneously increase with the size of the ecosystem. So if you see a company who appears to be highly innovative, highly customer focused, highly efficient, and that's simultaneously increasing at the same time that every now and then people complain that they've eaten our business model, you can bet they're running that sort of model. and you can't compete against that until you have a bigger ecosystem or you co-opt it in some way. And it requires a different set of gameplay. So I saw the Oracle announcements recently about we're going to take on Amazon in the cloud, and Amazon's rule is over. I mean, yeah. I find that you can exploit people's inertia. That's fair to say.
Yeah.
Well, I love the idea. I love that you both invoked Boyd, because I do think that's a extremely useful construct, is to think about, basically it's the idea being the speed at which you can run your cycles, if you can run them faster than your opponent, you can win. More often than not, you'll win. And I think that the thing in there that I think is interesting is that also, I mean, is it, you have to know who your opponent is in order to do that, in order to know how fast the cycles are. And I think one of the things that has made Amazon so successful is the cycle time by which they are able to run things and innovate and push. And they're certainly not the best in class out of the gate, but they get the stuff out. That's the thing. I think that's probably the advantage that Amazon has, is they launch before it's done. They launch before it's ready. They've created a culture that is able to, or willing and able to, take those kind of risks, and also to fail. I mean, had anyone been to Amazon auctions lately? Or, they fail, and when they fail, they recognize that they rein it in, they cut their losses and move on. And I think that they
brag about it. Like when Bezos was asked about the Fire phone, he said something like, "You should see the failures we are working on right now." And I mean, that's sort of the sort of daring master of the universe attitude to take towards experiments and failure.
So it's really interesting here, because when you look at Amazon, I would tend to argue that they don't create genuinely novel and new activities. They tend to take pre-existing activities, which they try to industrialize more. And it's interesting, because if you were going to do that internally within an organization, you would have to get everybody to focus on pre-existing acts which industrialize. And the best way I think you can do that is to introduce something called the press release process. Because if you require people to write the press release before they start on a project, you cannot write a press release for something that no one's invented, because you have no idea what it's going to be. But you can write a press release for something which already exists, but you're just going to an activity, a way of doing something that's there, but you're just going to industrialize it more, make it simpler. So, people run out of washing powder and they need to go to the shops and go to the till and all the rest of it. Well, the idea of creating a button, you just press the button and it's on its way to you. You can simplify pre-existing acts.
And that is a practice at Amazon's, exactly that. So, I mean, it's like it's a perfect connection to make, that I believe at some point they banned PowerPoint, and that was one of the things they replaced it with. Give me the one-page, description of what it's going to be like when it's done, or what's going to be like when it's launched.
Yep. Well, on that note, I think the consensus that Amazon is a great company is actually a great note to end this kind of conversation on. And it's kind of interesting that they also are perfect representatives of external and internal realities, because by their sort of effort to grow really big, really fast, they turn external realities into internal realities simply by expanding and covering them.
Can we just clarify?
Closing thoughts, yeah.
When we say Amazon is a great company, Amazon is a great industrial machine. Tearing up industries. I'm not sure everybody would agree that culturally it is a great company. You might.
I think that's a very fair point. It's like Walmart. If you were a cheap bastard, you belong in that culture, because that's how Walmart has been. Walmart has I think, and this is what I meant when I said earlier, there's not necessarily such a thing as or it's not very useful to think in terms of a great culture or a bad culture. It's useful to think of the fit between the culture and the environment. And I think maybe the way that I think I agree with what Simon's saying, the way to look at Amazon. Amazon is a very successful species.
Yeah.
It's an invasive species. Absolutely. It may or may not be a good species.
No, like you said, I mean, I believe in your point in a stronger way, that it's not that a culture is good or bad, it's about the fit, and Amazon has the culture it needs to win, and it's a selection effect. Like, people who can sort of thrive in that culture select in, people who can't cut it leave the company. And that's true of any culture. Like, I can't stand feel good. Actually, another company in the Amazon universe, Zappos, has sort of the oddly weird alternate culture of like, it almost feels like a kindergarten school environment. I took the Zappos tour, and it's weird that that exists in the Amazon system. But people self-select in and out of culture. So in that sense, there's no such thing as a good or bad culture. It's a winning or losing culture.
Right? We can't quit now that you mentioned Zappos, because I actually think
I'll let you do that.
I actually think that Zappos is a brilliant acquisition for Amazon for this reason. Amazon has one of the things you want to do when you're an experimental organization is you want to have experiments that are that negate each other. And what Amazon has done is, we know we're a company that is obsessed with customers, and Amazon looks at any interaction with a customer as a defect. In other words, if you call them for help, it's hard to call them for help. You have to email. Whenever they see a customer interaction happening where a person has to talk to a person, they see it as a defect they want to eliminate. Zappos is the opposite. Zappos sees any customer interaction as a way to start creating a human relationship. However, on the back end, they have exactly the same business. They have warehouses full of stuff that they have to very efficiently get orders and ship. And so what Amazon has done, I think, incredibly brilliantly with this acquisition of Zappos is it's making a bet that says, well, if we're wrong about our theory of customer interactions being a defect and wanting to make it just as easy as clicking and getting the thing, if we're wrong, then Zappos is a counter hypothesis that could be equally valid and is also interesting. But it's also very much within their business model, within their overall business model, which is being the store where you could buy everything. Zappos is their Nordstrom theory.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's like a cultural hedge fund that they're running. It's like a massive Darwinian cultural hedge fund that the ecosystem is.
So just to bring it back to something earlier you said about Ford, I mean, often when we go through these changes of underlying components becoming more utility-like, we see new forms of organization appear, new ways of operating. And so Ford was a new way of operating, so like a new species of organization. And what would have happened is they would have taken over everything had not the other organizations adapted and changed in practice. So that's the way I look at Amazon. It's not just a company that's doing well, but in terms of the way it operates, its mechanics, it is, as you say, a new species, a new form of organization. And I think that's what particularly makes it interesting. And the question I have is more about how well other organizations are adapting to that and whether they are adapting to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I wrote this book here. Figure out.
Plug your other book.
Yeah. And you've got the other one, right? The liminal. Yeah.
I don't know where I put it.
All right. Thank you both. And that was a really entertaining conversation. And hopefully people who watch this get some idea of how to map their internal and external realities.
Yeah, it was really a pleasure. Thanks. And great to meet you, Simon.
It was an absolute delight. Real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.